Hello, FFTCG community. I'm Judge Jared, and it's time for this week's iteration of Rules Roundup, where I go over questions that were asked in the unofficial global Discord server, rules questions, and both answer the questions, but also get into the rules and reasons behind those answers to hopefully help you get a better grip and understanding on how the rules work in this game, or if you already know how the rules work and you already know the answers to these, making sure that you understand the reasons behind it and that it's kind of a good way to quiz yourself here. So before I get into the questions that were actually asked in the Discord server, I have a couple of questions from you guys. In a couple situations, I had people reach out to me either directly or comment on videos and have some suggestions on things they wanted me to cover. And so I have the opportunity now to answer those, and we're going to start off with those today before I get into the ones that were in the Discord server. So let's do that to start with here. First question we've got is, in your next video, could you do some rulings on various monsters that can become forwards in their interactions with cards like Cucullin and Marlborough that blank cards? As you can see, Cucullin here, very straightforward cards he's allowed to play that can just choose a forward and remove its abilities. So the question here is about how effects like that interact with monsters that can also become forwards, because they're not naturally forwards. They have to become forwards through some sort of effect. So there's ultimately two different paths that monsters can take to become forwards. And I'm going to go over what both of those are and how cards like Cucullin that remove abilities affect or don't affect those monsters and when you cast or use those effects on them. So the first example here is Blue Worm. Now you can see with Blue Worm that it's got an action ability. It says until the end of the turn it becomes a 6k forward, and then it also creates this delayed auto ability that at the end of the turn breaks the Blue Worm. So after this action ability gets used, it creates that delayed auto ability. We're not worried about that for this question. But what happens is that the mechanism by which this becomes a forward is now an ongoing effect. So after that action ability resolves and Blue Worm becomes a 6k forward, it's an ongoing effect that is causing that to happen. And that ongoing effect is now independent of the Blue Worm. It's not an ability that's on it. It's just kind of this ongoing effect that's floating out here, and we don't really have ways in this game to interact with ongoing effects like that. Sometimes if the ongoing effect is created by a field ability, you can mess with that, but if it's something that resolved and created an ongoing effect, then we can't directly interact with that. So what I mean to say through all of this is that if you were to use an effect that removed Blue Worm's abilities after it had resolved its action ability, nothing would happen as far as it stopping being a forward. It would still be a forward because the mechanism by which it is a forward is not an ability that's on Blue Worm at that point. It's that ongoing effect that was created by the action ability resolving. So if you were to remove Blue Worm's abilities, you would essentially accomplish nothing because the auto ability on it already resolved when it entered the field, and it can't use that action ability again this turn anyway, and nothing about it being a forward is related to abilities on it. Now we're going to contrast that with the other mechanism by which monsters can become forwards. Looking at Piranha here. Now Piranha's first line of text says, during your turn, Piranha also becomes a forward with 4,000 power. So what this is a field ability in this scenario. The thing about field abilities is that they are always on. They're always in effect. And in some cases, they have certain requirements or certain just situations that cause them to either be doing something or not. And in the case of Piranha here, that requirement is that it is your turn. So the field ability is always there, it's always on, but during your opponent's turn, it's just not doing anything functionally because that requirement of it being your turn is not going on. But field ability is always happening. They don't use the stack. So if you were to remove Piranha's abilities via an effect like Marlborough resolving or casting Cucullin on it, then you would remove that field ability. And the moment that field ability has been removed, Piranha ceases to be a forward because now that ability has been shut off. So you've removed the mechanism by which it became a forward. Again, separate from before we had this ongoing effect that was kind of floating out there. So yeah, you get very different results here depending on it. So if you're considering using an effect that removes abilities to try to stop a monster from being a forward, you just want to look at whether or not the way that it's become a forward is due to a field ability or due to an ongoing effect. And if it's a field ability, knock yourselves out. Okay, next question that I got from somebody was, wanted to chime in with a small video idea for you. Was just playing a friend. He didn't understand how abilities can fizzle when they have no valid targets on resolution. For example, he played Titus LB, chose his backup and a forward and draw 2, but the backup and forward weren't there on resolution, so I had to explain that he didn't get a draw 2 from it. All right, so there's a couple things to understand here with this. This is, of course, the Titus LB that is, when it enters the field, I'm not going to get into the whole conditions that lead to it, but essentially when it resolves, you get to select up to 3 out of 3 actions. The first one is choosing a forward, second one is choosing a backup, and the third one is drawing 2 cards. The forward and backup get put on the top and the bottom of the deck. And so first thing to understand here is that whenever we have an effect with multiple actions that you're selecting from, whatever actions get chosen, they all get bound together, essentially, once the selection is finished. They all get enjoined into one effect, typically an ability, but there are also, of course, summons that have multiple actions that you choose from, but one effect on the stack. And so for better or worse, they're enjoined together, which means that once you've selected those actions, if this were to get chosen by Amaterasu to cancel, it would cancel the entire thing and not just like the choosing the forward or choosing the backup. So if we understand that concept, that they're all enjoined together, then we want to get into the other idea, and this is a broad idea within FFTCG that I think is really important to understand if you don't already, which is that whenever there's an effect that chooses at least one target, so we're using the word choose here specifically, not selecting, but choosing a target. If an effect chooses at least one target, then the way it's going to resolve is dependent on whether, when you go to resolve it, whether all of the targets have become invalid, or if at least one target is still valid when it resolves. What I mean by if it's valid is not just is it on the field still, but is it still a legal target? There could be any number of reasons why it's not a legal target anymore. But is it valid, is it still going to be affected when the ability resolves, or the effect resolves rather? So you have this kind of binary possibility for resolution. Either none of the chosen targets are valid, or at least one of them is. Now in the scenario that at least one of the targets is still valid, the effect is going to resolve as much as it can. So let's say we have the forward and the backup here. Let's say that the forward left the field before Titus's ability resolves. What's going to happen is that the backup, you're going to carry that out. It's going to go to the top of the deck, and then you'll draw the 2 cards. So you resolve as much as possible. Similarly, if the backup was gone, but the forward was still there, then the forward go to the bottom of the deck, you draw 2 cards. Now what happens if all targets are invalid when it goes to resolve? Then the entire effect gets canceled. So let's say the forward, I cast Chocobo and turn it to my hand, and the backup had an ability where I could dull it and break it to do something, so I did that. And now my opponent, who had used Titus and chose those 2, now neither of those targets are valid when it resolves, so now they don't get to draw 2 cards because 0 targets are still valid on resolution. So this is a really important concept to understand, not just for Titus, but literally any effect in the game that chooses at least one target. So you just want to keep that in mind. It's one of the things you want to burn into your head. If it chooses and there's at least one target still valid on resolution, you resolve it as much as possible. If there are 0 targets valid on resolution, the whole thing gets canceled. All right, on to questions from the Discord server. First one says, hi, for EX like Rosa or Wind Cater from Opus 25, does Cecil or the 2 cadets for Cater need to be on the field to draw 1 card? So the question here is, both of these are X bursts that, as part of their text, say that they require having a certain thing on the field. For Rosa, it's having a Cecil. For Cater, it's having 2 or more job class 0 cadets. So let's go over kind of the structure of an X burst, but also specifically these type of X bursts, because these X bursts are conditional auto abilities. So conditional auto abilities have 3 parts to them. There is the trigger event, the condition, and the effect. They're all separated by commas. So The first part here is the trigger event. In the case of Cater, it's going to be when Cater enters the field. For Rosa, it's when Rosa enters the field. With X bursts, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to ignore the trigger event whenever we're triggering X bursts. So we just take whatever that trigger is, and we're just saying, yeah, that happened for the purposes of resolving this. We're just replacing that trigger event with the fact that the X is being triggered. Then after that comma, we have our condition. In the case of Cater, it's if you control 2 or more job class 0 cadets. In the case of Rosa, it's if you control a card named Cecil. There's a comma then. And then after that second comma, we have the effect. What happens? In both cases, it's drawing a card, right? So trigger event, condition, effect. So the question here is, do we still need to have the relevant cards on the field for the effect? Now, I mentioned that X bursts ignore the trigger event. However, they will not ignore the condition that's on there if there is a condition for the X burst effect. So if you flip over Cater for damage and you only have 1 or less job class 0 cadets, then you're not going to get the draw. If you flip over Rosa for damage and you don't control Cecil, you're not going to get the draw. Right, next we have maybe a silly question, but does this game have any specific wording around damage dealt versus losing power? For example, Yuzuki says damage dealt is reduced, but Titus will make a target lose power for each category 10 entering. Would Titus damage be reduced, or would it be normal since the wording is different? Thanks for the help. So Yuzuki, we're looking at her first ability here. It says if a fire forward you control is dealt damage by your opponent's abilities, the damage becomes 0 instead. I guess we could look at the second one too, which is that if a water forward you control is dealt damage, reduced by 2,000. So the question is, does that affect Titus's effect? Titus, his auto ability says when Titus or a category 10 character enters your field, choose 1 forward opponent controls, and it loses 4,000 power to the end of the turn. This question boils down to, is losing power the same thing as damage? The short answer on that is no. It is not losing damage. So as a result, an effect that causes a forward to lose damage will not be affected at all by any other abilities or summons that specifically interact with damage being dealt. It's part of what makes effects that make you lose power actually essentially more powerful than damage. Part of it is because there's a lot less cards that will stop that from happening. But also it has the other parts of it, like it's lowering the forward's power if there's an attacking or blocking situation and stuff. So yeah, long-winded way of saying that that Yuzuki will not stop Titus's 4,000 reduction. So it could be used on Yuzuki and it'll reduce her by 4,000 or any other forward that the Yuzuki player has there. All right, next question. I know priming is considered an ability, but because both cards are essentially same name, does a card that primes effectively mean new character has entered the field via ability? This one we're going to do a real quick answer on, which the answer here is no. Priming does not count as a new character entering the field. And the reason why I'm making this so short is because I'm actually going to direct you to another video that I've made here already all about priming, which was Judge Jared Explains Priming. So yeah, if you want to do a deep dive into priming and all the things about it, then go check out that video. I will answer all the questions you've ever had about priming and probably answer some questions you didn't even realize you had about priming. But one of the things that I really stress in that video is the fact that when you prime, it does not count as a new character entering the field. So yeah, that's the answer there with that question. Next question is, ran into this issue in a game I played with a friend this weekend, and we were hoping to get some clarification. When a forward has a when X attacks ability, when does this ability trigger? Is it during attack declaration or during damage resolution? For example, if someone attacked with Fang, would they be able to cast a Bahamut at reduced cost before their opponent could declare blockers, or would they need to wait until after damage resolution? Now, Fang here, she's got this auto ability. It says when she attacks, then the cost required to cast your next Bahamut is reduced by 2. So the question they're asking here, of course, is, we know what the trigger is. The trigger is when she attacks, but at what point is she considered to have attacked? Is it when the attack is declared, or is it when damage is being dealt and when damage resolution happens? And I can get where that question's coming from, because it might seem like, well, until she's actually like hit somebody, she's not attacking, right? She's just kind of, she's declaring an intent to attack. But as far as the game rules are concerned, as soon as you declare the attack and you've, unless she has brave, you've dulled her and all that. As soon as you declared the attack, then she is considered to have attacked, regardless of what happens after that point. Whether she ends up leaving the field before damage resolution, if she gets blocked, if she doesn't get blocked, whatever, she's attacked, which means that right after declaring that attack, that auto ability of hers is going to go on the stack. Presumably it'll resolve, and then you'll be able to cast Bahamut at reduced cost. Now, after the declare attack step, there is a priority there, which is where this auto ability is going to go and resolve, and that all occurs before the block declaration step. So to answer the question directly, there is that priority window after the attack declaration where you're going to be able to cast a Bahamut before the opponent has a chance to declare a blocker. So you can attack with Fang, auto ability goes on the stack, auto ability resolves. You're still before the block declaration step, and the Fang player can now cast Bahamut at that reduced cost to try to remove a blocker before you get to the block declaration step. All right, next question is, does Cid Randell stop the demon's auto ability when the demon is attacking? I can think of two reasons why this person might be asking this question. Without more information, I don't know which one they're going for, but I'm going to try to deal with both possibilities here. Cid Randell, if you're not familiar, his field ability says opposing forwards entering the field will not trigger any auto abilities. So the demon here has an auto ability. It doesn't really matter what it does for this question, but the auto ability it has triggers both when it enters the field and when it attacks. So I could see a world where somebody's asking this question because they're like, well, because that auto ability the demon has triggers both from entering the field and attacking, like because those things are kind of connected there, does that mean that it still stops the demon's auto ability from triggering on attack as well because it stopped it when it entered? The answer to that would be no. It has nothing to do with there being multiple possible trigger events for it. It still wouldn't stop that. Then the other reason why this could be getting asked is just kind of the vague nature of the language here. It says opposing forwards entering the field will not trigger any auto abilities. And in a vacuum, if you're not familiar with the wording on these things, it might sound like that's like a permanent condition. It might sound like, well, when your forward enters the field, because I have Cid Randell, it's not going to trigger auto abilities ever, for any reason at all, right? It might just seem like you've just kind of tagged it with like a field of anti-auto abilities. But that's not the case either. Cid Randell specifically is just saying that if there's any auto abilities that would trigger because of that forward entering your opponent's field, those auto abilities that are related to a forward entering their field, those will not trigger. Everything else is still fair game. So yeah, so the demon, if they play it while you have Cid Randell, it's not going to trigger when it enters, but then if and when the demon does attack, it's still going to trigger as normal. Cid Randell can't stop any of that. Now, you would think that we're done talking about Cid Randell, but we're not, because the next question is also about Cid Randell. So here, the question is, hi there, I'm very new to FFTCG, and I had some trouble against Cid Randell. In the part in brackets, why wasn't it enough to say this applies to their own abilities? Why does the other part in the bracket, or what does the other part in the bracket refer to? Also, Cid Randell negates when effects, I swear I can talk today, only when forwards enter the field, right? That second part we literally just covered. So yeah, Cid Randell only stops effects that are when the opponent's forwards are entering the field. I'm just going to kind of quickly point out, they say that it negates those effects, but I don't want to say negates, that sounds like the effect happened and then it canceled it. It's really just preventing it from triggering at all in the first place. But to answer the other part of the question, which is about the parentheses portion of Cid Randell's text, and we didn't talk about this part of it yet, but in parentheses it says, this applies to their own abilities and abilities triggered by your opponent's forward entering their field. So quick little note here is that whenever we have something in parentheses, it's called reminder text. And reminder text, about 97% of the time, means that it's text that they didn't actually have to put on the card. Like if they had left that entire section of parentheses off, it would not affect the way that the card, the text actually works, the way that you would resolve how that works in a rule sense. There is a small minority of scenarios where they actually do put like super important text in the parentheses that if it wasn't there would absolutely change the way that the card resolves, but we're not going to talk about that right now because this is not one of those. So it's reminder text, but then we're like, okay, what is this reminder text really telling us, or why is it worded this way? The reason is that Cid Randell is not just preventing, like there's so many forwards that have an auto ability on themselves when they enter that triggers. And that's most of the time what Cid Randell is stopping. But sometimes there are other cards. It could be a forward, it could be a backup, whatever. There are other cards that trigger when a forward enters your field. And Cid Randell is going to stop those as well. Let me give you examples here. The first is, let's say I'm a Knights player. My opponent has Cid Randell, and I've got Lastwell on the field. So let's, I guess we'll start off by saying, let's say they already had Cid Randell, and then I cast Lastwell. His auto ability says when he enters the field, choose one character, dull it, and freeze it. Well, if the opponent controls Cid Randell when I play Lastwell, Lastwell's not going to trigger from entering the field because it's being prevented. But then let's say right after that, I cast Ramza. So Ramza, under normal circumstances, when I cast him, because Lastwell's other part of his ability says the another trigger event for it is when a Job Knight enters your field. Normally the Ramza would trigger Lastwell. So even though it's not Ramza's ability, that trigger event is causing Lastwell to trigger, his auto ability to trigger. But due to the opponent having Cid Randell, Lastwell is now not going to trigger for that either. So it's not just about his own ability, it's about him normally triggering off of another character entering, another forward specifically entering my field. So Cid Randell is going to stop that from triggering. On the flip side, let's say that my opponent who controls Cid Randell, let's say that they had Mira here. Mira is a really interesting card because she triggers when your opponent's forward enters the field, right? It says when the opponent's forward enters the field, you may pay 1 and discard a monster, and then when you do so, break that forward. So let's say that my opponent who has Cid Randell also controls Mira. Normally what happens is if a forward enters my field, then their Mira is going to trigger the auto ability. But because of Cid Randell is now actually stopping the Mira as well. So it's not just a one-way thing here. It's like, oh, only my cards are not going to trigger off of a forward entering my field. Like, no, it's literally all auto abilities that trigger from a forward entering my field, the opponent of Cid Randell, they're not going to trigger. So there's not many effects like this with Mira where that trigger off of your opponent's forwards entering the field. But if you do have them, then Cid Randell is going to turn those off as well. It actually ends up being a hindrance there. So that's why they put in the parentheses that it's not just auto abilities of the forward entering the field, but also any other auto abilities that trigger from that forward entering the field. We're talking about anything else in the field that cares about a forward entering the opponent's side from whoever has Cid Randell. All right, next question here is player A controls Golbez. Opus 1 Golbez here. We're taking it back. If you've been playing as long as I have, then you're like, ooh, we're talking about Golbez right now. Player B steals it via playing Chaos. During the game, Golbez in player B's control is broken and goes back to player A's break zone. Does player A or player B get the effects of the Golbez auto ability? Clarity in who controls Golbez at this point and why would be greatly appreciated. This Golbez, for those of you who are not, I guess, FFTCG boomers like myself, I guess he has a really cool effect where when he goes to the break zone from the field, you can search your deck for up to 4 forwards of cost 2 that are all different elements and then play them onto the field. So he just vomits out a bunch of 2 costs from your deck onto the field. So the question here is that a player played Golbez, and then the opponent stole Golbez, and then while they still had control of that stolen Golbez, they broke it. So the question is, who gets the effect here of him going to the break zone? Is it the person who stole the Golbez, or is it the person who played the Golbez in the first place? To answer this, it's the important concept to remember is that it's based off of who controls the forward at the time that it's moving zones. So in this case, it's the person who stole it. They controlled Golbez last. And part of why this is not the most intuitive thing is because the way that it's worded and the way that we actually like work this all out are not really intuitive with each other. The auto ability says when Golbez is put from the field in the break zone. So you would think, based off of the language of that, it's triggering when Golbez is already in the break zone, right? Because it's the trigger event is when he's in the break zone. So you would think like, okay, well, he's got to already be there. And if you're not familiar already, when you steal an opponent's card, if it changes zones, it goes to the owner's version of that zone. So Golbez is going to go back to the break zone of the person who originally, or the person who owned it, the person whose deck it's from. So they're in the owner's zone, but then how is it triggering for the opponent? And the reason for this is that when there's a trigger that is based off of zone movement, so it could be whether it's a trigger from going back to your hand, going to the break zone, wherever. There's kind of this weird nuanced situation where like it's after you've determined which zone the card is about to move to, but before it is actually physically moved there, that's when the auto ability triggers. It's weird because it actually triggers before the thing has happened, right? Like Golbez has not actually gone to the break zone, but once we know for sure he's about to go to the break zone, it's kind of like in that last little split second, like he's like 1 foot out the door, and we're like, yep, he's going to the break zone. So now it's triggering, and at that point, it's the person who controls him. That's who the auto ability is triggering for. So in this case, it's the person who stole him. Again, not very intuitive, but anytime a zone movement triggers, they are triggering before the forward has actually, or the character has actually left the field. So something to keep in mind there. It's tricky and might take kind of hearing that multiple times for it to stick, but that's how it works. All right. Next question is, how can I discard a copy of Cloud if he's in the LB zone? Doesn't it need to be in my hand? We had a question about this same exact card in a similar situation, I think, in the previous rules roundup I did. So let's just kind of fast forward through this really quick. Yes, this is a limit break Cloud, and yes, to pay for the special ability cost, you do need to discard a copy of Cloud to pay the S cost. But as a reminder, special ability rules say that you don't need to discard a copy of exactly the same serial number. It just has to be a card named Cloud. So any card that's of any serial number that's card name is Cloud, you can discard that to pay for the special ability. So the only possible way to use the special ability on this Cloud, since he is a limit break card, is to have other copies that are not limit break ones in your deck. For example, in my Wind Lightning Cadets deck, I'm using the Wind Lightning Cloud, but I also have this in my limit break deck. So it's possible if I end up casting this from a limit break and then I draw that other copy, I can discard that copy to use the Cloud special ability. All right, next question is, so I have a question just on how cards such as Duke operate. This is Duke Snakeheart. Mostly, is there a time between them entering where summons can be used before block declaration? For example, Mateus. This is actually kind of similar to the Fang question about the timing between declaring the attack and declaring a blocker. So quick rundown of the attack phase. Attack phase has 4 sub-steps to it. We have attack preparation, followed by attack declaration, followed by block declaration, followed by damage resolution. And then if there's multiple attacks, it's going to swing back up to attack declaration, and then just repeat those last 3 steps however many times is necessary. There's a priority between each one of those steps, so both players have to consecutively pass priority without doing something to go between those steps. So back attack here, of course, is that field ability that allows a player to cast this character anytime that they have priority and are allowed to cast things. So as you can see from the effect here, he's got an auto ability that says that when he blocks, then the effect breaks both him and anything that he's blocking. So the way you will see this get played is player attacks, and then the other player uses back attack, casts Duke Snakeheart to the field, blocks the attacker, they both break, right? And so the person who's attacking now, they're like, hey, is there a window for me to remove Duke Snakeheart? Or once they back attack him in, are they just allowed to go, all right, I cast Duke Snakeheart, using back attack, he's here, I declare him as a blocker, and now we've triggered the ability. And the answer here is that there is absolutely an opportunity for the attacking player to remove Duke Snakeheart first. The reason for this is because, as I said before, you have the attack declaration step followed by the block declaration step, and there's a priority between those. But in order for Duke Snakeheart to enter the field in time to be declared as a blocker, he needs to be cast after attack declaration has happened, during that priority window right there, before you moved on to block declaration. And so Duke Snakeheart gets cast, but he's not blocking yet. And so since both players need to pass priority at that point to go to block declaration, where your opponent can declare Duke Snakeheart as a blocker, there's that window right there where the attacking player can now cast a summon, use an ability, or what have you to prevent Duke Snakeheart from blocking. So yes, there is that window between when he gets cast and when the block declaration happens. For those of you wondering, like, oh, well, can I just wait until block declaration if I'm the Duke Snakeheart player? No, you can't, because once you move to block declaration, the very first thing that happens in that step is declaring a blocker. And if you haven't declared a blocker at the beginning of that step, it's too late. You can't declare one. So if you're in the priority window after block declaration and you go, okay, I cast Duke Snakeheart now, and now I declare him as a blocker. Well, you can't, because you've actually just passed the point at which you were allowed to declare a blocker. So there's basically no way to do shenanigans here where you can just cast Duke and then immediately jump right into declaring a block without the possibility for your opponent interacting. All right. If you've been watching the last few of these, you know me. I like to end this with a bit of a whammy of a question. So we have a complicated one here. It fills up the entire screen. And I'll show the cards that are being asked about here in a second. But let's read the question. It says, hello, I need some clarification regarding conditional field abilities, gained abilities, and entwined interactions. Number 1, I have a Raijin and Fujin with 10 plus cards in the break zone. I blank Fujin. Does Raijin keep the first strike? And does Raijin keep the power granted by Fujin, the plus 2000, or loses it, as it's not an ability and the source of that power increase is now blank? Second question, I have Raijin and Fujin. My opponent blanks Fujin, so Fujin loses haste. My break zone goes to 9 cards, and then I manage to make it 10 cards. Fujin gains haste again, right? In other words, even if I blank the source of a field buff, once it's given, right? I remember a couple of months ago when Turbo Chaos was a thing, many people in my region would call in Raijin to also prevent Fujin from attacking. Thanks in advance. All right, before we get into the question here, just in case you're not familiar, let's go over what Raijin and Fujin both do. They're very similar. So, Fujin has this field ability that says, if there are 10 or more cards in your break zone, then the Cypher and then any other disciplinary committee member forwards that you control gain plus 2000 power and first strike. That's the crux of the question here, right? So if we rewind to what I was talking about earlier in this video about field abilities sometimes have requirements that need to be met in order for them to actually functionally do anything. In the case of Fujin, there needs to be 10 cards in the break zone, otherwise nothing's happening with this ability. And the moment that we are below 10, then it's essentially shutting off whatever boost it would give. And the moment that we go back to 10, or we go to 10 for the first time, is when it's instantly now having a tangible effect. So she's giving plus 2k and first strike. And then Raijin does the same thing if you look at him, except that he's giving plus 2000 power and haste. Again, this is to the other disciplinary committee members and Cypher. So let's backtrack a second to the questions. First one is, they control both those forwards. They have 10 cards. They've met the requirement. And then Fujin gets blanked. It's kind of funny reading this question because the person is saying that they control both these cards, but then they're saying that they're blanking Fujin. So I don't know. It's a real power move to like call in your own Fujin, but it's okay. We'll answer the question anyway. So Fujin gets her abilities removed. The question is, does Raijin keep the first strike? The answer is no, because just like the Piranha question, this is actually really tying in a lot of the other things from earlier in the video. The field ability, as soon as it gets shut off, it's no longer providing what it's providing. So it's not like an ongoing effect that once it resolves, it's just floating out there and it's doing its thing. It's only active for as long as it
meets whatever requirements it has, and also only is active for as long as it exists, right? So the moment that Fujin loses her abilities, nobody is getting first strike from it. It's just like the source of this first strike that was being projected outward is just shut down. The other part of this question is, does Raijin keep the power granted by it or lose it, as it's not an ability and the source of that power increase is now blank? The answer is Raijin would also lose the 2000 power for the same exact reason. The whole thing is tied together there. If it had been an ongoing effect that had given Raijin both haste, first strike and the 2000 power, then removing Raijin's abilities would remove the first strike but not the 2000, because gaining power is not it doesn't count as an ability there. But yeah, in this scenario, Fujin gets blanked, then Raijin has now lost both the first strike and the 2000 power. Second question here is a little more complicated. They say again they have both those forwards we just looked at. My opponent blanks Fujin. Okay, so at least in this example, it's the opponent doing it. Opponent blanks Fujin, so now Fujin loses haste. For that matter, everybody would lose haste that was gaining it. But then it says my break zone goes to 9 cards, and then I managed to make it 10. So Fujin gains haste again. Actually, let me double check here. So Fujin's the one who gives. Okay, so I get these two confused sometimes, which one does what. So to make sure I'm clear on this. So yeah, Fujin was getting blanked in the situation, but Fujin had been gaining haste from Raijin's field ability, right? So that haste was getting projected at Fujin. Fujin got blanked, so now Fujin lost the haste. Okay. Now the question is, the person's break zone goes down to 9 cards. At that point, Raijin, his field ability, is no longer providing haste to anybody, right? Because that requirement of 10 cards in the break zone has not been met. But then we're going back to 10 cards. Something else happens, it goes back to 10 cards. The easy thing to understand in this situation is if we just look at Raijin in a vacuum here for a second. If there's 10 cards in the break zone, Raijin is giving himself haste. If it goes down to 9 cards, Raijin is no longer giving himself haste. And then as soon as it goes back to 10 cards, Raijin's giving himself haste, right? But the question is, how does that interact with Fujin over here, who had her abilities blanked a second ago? And this is really interesting. I hope I can explain this in a way that makes sense. But here's where we have to talk about timestamps. A lot of people are not familiar with timestamps. But essentially, timestamps are that the game is tracking the order of events that is going on. In terms of like when this ability resolved, or when this character entered the field, or when this person attacked. It's tracking timestamps for everything. And most of the time, these timestamps are not important. They don't actually, like, there's nothing that really references them or is necessary. But there are some very, very important scenarios where they do come up, and this is one of them. Because we had a field ability before, that Raijin's field ability that was giving haste. I said before that it's just that constantly projecting haste. So a lot of times people think, wait a second, if I like Kukulin Fujin and she loses haste, doesn't she just get it back right away because Raijin is just continually like kind of broadcasting this haste? To answer that question, the answer is no, Fujin does not gain the haste back, and that's because of timestamps. It's because if we look at it as like a timeline here, we have that there was the point in time where Raijin gave Fujin the haste, which could be when it went to 10 cards, it could be when Fujin entered the field, whatever point Fujin gained haste, that there's a timestamp there of blip, this is the moment in time where Fujin gained haste. Right, then further down the timeline from there is when Kukulin blanks Fujin. And because that's the more recent timestamp, that gets the precedent here. It cuts off the haste. And because the source of the haste was before the timestamp of the Kukulin, that's why it doesn't just come back right away afterward. Now, hopefully you followed that so far, because what's going to happen here now is the reason why the Kukulin blanked that before was because it was more recent. Its timestamp was more recent than when Fujin originally gained the haste to begin with. But what happens is we have this scenario where we are taking the 10 cards in the breakdown, and now it's going down to 9, right? So that was when Raijin stopped giving haste to anybody, and then it goes back to 10, and that's when Raijin starts giving haste again. If that event happens after the Cucullin, then now we have Raijin's ability giving haste with a more recent timestamp than the Cucullin. Hopefully that makes sense. But yes, we have, so that moment in time where Cucullin resolved, there's a timestamp there of that. After that, in the timeline here, we have going down to 9 cards, coming back up to 10. So now we have a more recent timestamp for Raijin that is projecting haste again, which means Fujin gains haste again because it's a more recent timestamp. Which, if you're not familiar with timestamps, you might be a little bit like mind blown right now. If you are familiar with timestamps, you're going to be like, yeah, that's not very interesting. I know how timestamps work. But for those of you who weren't familiar or just a little bit shaky with how timestamps work, yeah, it's a really interesting interaction there. The fact that since the field ability was no longer providing haste and then suddenly provided haste again, and that kind of re-providing happened after the Cucullin had resolved, suddenly haste is back. It's back on the menu, boys. So, yeah, getting back to the original question here is if it goes back to 10. Fujin gains haste again, right? Yes, Fujin gains haste again. It's a fun little interaction right there. Yeah, so that should answer the question there and kind of introduce the concept of timestamps if you weren't familiar with it. But that should be my last question for today. So, I hope you enjoyed these questions. I hope that all that made sense. If not, feel free to leave a comment here on the video. I'm happy to try to explain some more if necessary. And yeah, thanks for watching. I just passed 100 subscribers on YouTube, which is awesome. So thank you to all 101 of you at the time that I'm recording this for subscribing. You're awesome. And if you haven't subscribed yet, then why don't you join the 101? They're all cool people. You could be a cool person too. You're probably cool already, but you could be even cooler. You could be even cooler if you subscribe. So yeah, like the video, subscribe. If you have any questions, do a comment. If you have anything you want me to cover, do a comment or send a message to me, whether it's on Facebook or commenting on the video here on YouTube or on the hellscape that is Twitter. I'm at Judge Jared on Twitter as well, so you can also check over there. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you sitting here and watch through the end. So yeah, I'm Judge Jared. Thank you for watching, and until next time, court is adjourned.